Hi, everybody. This is Sarah Grossman from the Dru Project, and I am here to introduce two of my most favorite people. I'm not even in the screen, am I? Okay, sorry. Emma Mahn and Doreen Magee. Um, they are both therapists. They both have fabulous red glasses, and they both are about to walk us through a discussion on grief, COVID-19, racism, and what is going on in America right now with the collective trauma we're all experiencing. And with that, Emma, if you want to start by telling us a little bit about yourself, and then Doreen can do the same, and then you guys can get started. All right, cool.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Sarah. Hello. My name, like Sarah said, is Emma Mahn. I am a clinical social worker. I have specialties in working with people with addictions as well as eating disorders, and I have a really cute dog. So that's a little bit about me.
And I'm Doreen Dodgen-Magee. I am a psychologist. I'm in Portland, Oregon. And I'm also a survivor fellow along with Sarah, who just introduced us, having lost my sister-in-law and three nieces to gun violence 25 years ago. And I know, Emma, you were going to make some statements just that we wanted to make sure and make before we started.
Yeah, I think that in light of everything that's been going on the past couple of weeks, we wanted to just like first and foremost acknowledge that we recognize that maybe as two white women, our voices are not necessarily the ones that need to be elevated right now. And at the same time, we recognize that people of color, especially Black people, are not the ones that are needing to be doing a lot of the educating going on. And so just wanting to acknowledge our privilege in this and pointing out that we have some awareness of what's going on in the world, and that we want to make it clear that we stand with Black lives, and think that that's important discussions that are happening. So
Yeah,
yeah.
I also want to just second that and say that we've tried to privilege some Black and Brown voices in the resources that we have gathered for you all for later, and will continue to do so. I know on my website, and I believe also that Sarah is arranging for that with the Dru Project. So the other thing that we wanted to do before we started off today was just to literally give some time and to take about 30 seconds of silence to very intentionally honor those who have been lost to police brutality, to gun violence, and specifically to those 49 people lost at Pulse, which that day will be memorialized tomorrow. So wherever you are, maybe you want to put your hands on your heart or close your eyes, but let's just take 30 seconds to honor those lives. Maybe take a deep breath in and a deep breath out. And if you have someone in mind that you have lost, that is the source of kind of grief that you're wanting to think about specifically today as we talk, you can say that name out into the space, even though we can't hear you. I have to believe that we are together in this conversation and can energetically really provide support to each other. I wanted to just give a couple of seconds of words about trauma and grief, and then Emma is going to continue that on to talk about how multiple traumas impact us. But there's an analogy that I often use when I talk about trauma to help us understand what's going on with ourselves and those around us. when we have experienced a trauma, and especially when we've experienced traumatic loss. And then we are in a time like this where we are facing the loss of our autonomy related to kind of sheltering in place, the loss of maybe our ideals or wishes about our country in response to race and police brutality. All of those kinds of losses kind of get inside and hook us when we have had previous traumas. And the way that that happens is a little bit like this. I talk about it as pre-trauma, where it's like we're walking through a field and we see this beautiful sky and we see the expansive earth around us, and we're just having this amazing walk, and we are kind of lost in the moment and not really hyper aware or alert about a lot of things. And we notice a little bit down to our right over here that there's this small coiled object, but we don't think much of it, and we keep walking. And then all of a sudden we feel this sharp pain in our ankle, and there is adrenaline surging through our bodies. There are all kinds of neurotransmitters being released that are not normally flooding our brain. And basically we look down and realize, oh my goodness, that small coiled object was actually a snake. And when that happens, in that moment, we have now encoded in our very cells of our body that the next time we're walking around without thinking about it, we could be at danger of a snake bite. And then especially if we're walking around and we see a small coiled object somewhere, and maybe it's a hose, our body does not respond as though it's a hose. Our body responds as though it is a snake. So even though everyone around us may think we are completely safe and should not be having any kind of reactivity, our whole body goes into this hyper alert state. We go into a state of fight, flee, freeze, or faint. Whew, those F's.
Tongue twister.
And we and we just don't have the same kind of coping or even rational skills that we would normally have. All of the fear centers of our brain are hyper alert. All of the rationing centers of our brain shut down. And so we are reacting in ways that maybe don't make sense to ourselves and others. And we wanted to start this conversation off like that because probably many people here have experienced trauma in general, and possibly traumatic losses in particular, that are being really piqued and triggered right now, especially if you have lots of them, which I know, Emma, you're going to speak to.
Yeah, I think that it's such an important piece to notice how much trauma affects every part of your body. And I think that's a little bit to what you're speaking to, that as we are moving through life, you move through in a different way after experiencing trauma, and that can kind of show up sometimes as like hypervigilance. It can show up as sleep disturbance. It can show up as emotional dysregulation. It can show up as increase or decrease in appetite. Like there are so many things that are connected to trauma that we sometimes don't recognize, and then we'll be treating these other symptoms instead of treating kind of what's at the core, which is the trauma. And I think also sometimes people are hesitant to name things as trauma or name things as grief that they've experienced, because we have this idea that trauma has to be this like really big, major, life-changing thing, and it often is. And other times it can be something that may seem smaller to other people, but it impacts you in a really meaningful way. And so I think that is also another part of trauma that's important to discuss.
That, and something that you said just made me think of the fact that there's also trauma and grief related when we experience a trauma that we may not rationally tell ourselves we're personally connected to. I think this happens with situations like mass shootings, like at Pulse, where, our gay, brown, black, brothers and sisters are killed, and we tell ourselves we don't have the right to grieve. I think that's happening a lot right now. If we aren't directly connected, we tend to kind of say it's not okay or it shouldn't matter, when in reality we are experiencing those things internally as real losses. Do you know what, does that make sense?
I think what you're kind of speaking to is this idea of like collective trauma, that when a country, for example, goes through a traumatic event, even though it might not have impacted you personally, just hearing about it, like for example, the murder of George Floyd, that I'm a white woman, that didn't impact, I'm not moving through the world as a black person, absolutely. And that is going to be maybe more impactful for people of color, but watching somebody be murdered and watching somebody lose their life on screen, that is something, it's a very viral video. So millions of people have seen it, and that is going to impact people. That is a collective trauma that people have experienced. And yeah, I think it's important not to minimize the impact of that, and to be able to discuss how that can impact us as a country as well when we experience trauma like that. Or same with, Pulse. Even though we weren't there, like you were saying, you might not have been there, but it is still something that you learned about, that you were hearing like video recordings of, or just videos of in general. And watching those things can be traumatic. Obviously, not to the same extent, but
Right. I actually am curious. I would love to hear from you since I'm, not a part of the community that you're a part of. I would imagine that within the queer community and the gay community that there are particular kinds of grief right now that are also that are specifically being kind of piqued or pulled at by what's going on culturally.
yeah, I think that it felt like there was a lot of progress for queer people that had been made in the last like 10 years. And for me personally, I don't know if I can speak to the community as a whole, but for me personally, seeing some legislation that seems to be rolling back rights for LGBT people, it does feel like, yeah, that there is a sense of rights being threatened, which is
Yeah.
impactful for the community. Yeah.
Yeah. And I really loved when you and I, yeah, well, yeah, I feel like there are, I feel like there are communities who have been shoved to the margins by majority culture in a way that creates kind of almost cellular trauma, and this is a community that I feel like has just been mistreated horribly for my. So
Yeah,
anyway.
well, I think that, like, I mean, there's a lot of research that's done on generational trauma as well, right? Looking at the way that trauma is actually passed on through your genes, and that can impact the way that you move through the world. So, looking at an event, say like slavery, which was an extremely traumatic event for an entire group of people, those people then passed down that trauma through their genes, and Black people are now living with that trauma still in their genes. And so I think similarly to people in the queer community that have experienced pretty traumatic events as a group, yeah, that those things can be passed down as well.
Yeah. I really love what you brought up the other day when we were talking too about the judgment that can come up with grief, and I wondered like if you could maybe bring that up with everybody. I just thought it was a really genius thing to remember.
Yeah, I think something that I hear a lot from my clients is like, oh well, I shouldn't grieve, or like, oh, it's not that bad, or well, somebody has it worse. So there's this kind of comparison trap that happens a lot with grief, I think. And um, so thinking like, well, say like I lost my dog, and that I don't have a right to feel sad about it because there are people in the world that don't have parents, or that um, lost people really close to them, or whatever the comparison that you want to get into. And I think it's important, like you said, yeah, that non-judgmental stance, that um, looking at your grief as like just individually your grief, rather than looking at it like from a comparative lens, because that's a trap that is going to end in misery, right? When we start to compare, there's always going to be somebody who's experienced something worse, and there's always going to be somebody who has it better off. And so I think when looking at something like grief, it's important to really look at it from an individual lens, and look at how it's impacting you and what your emotional experience is to that grief, rather than whether it's like a big enough event, or
Right.
important enough. I don't know.
Something that you just said also led me to think about how that I think sometimes people don't even including myself, don't even realize that maybe what we're feeling is grief, that we feel a flood of big emotions, or we can sense that there's something kind of like, wow, I'm just not being able, I'm hearing this a lot these days. I'd love to know if you are, I'm not being able to focus. Like I go in a room to do something and I get there and I can't remember what I was going to do, or I am not sleeping as well, or, that there are all these strong feelings that sometimes we can more easily name, like anger or sadness, but we don't always identify like the loss that can create grief in our normal experiences. I've been thinking about that a lot with COVID, just that, that the loss of freedom of moving about in the world like we normally do, the loss of things we had been planning to do, the loss of job, the loss of income, that there are these kind of multiple things on top of each other. Are you hearing similar things?
Yeah, I think that similar idea that sorry, I just lost my train of thought. I was thinking
That's
about
fine.
something else that you had said. Yeah, this idea that as an entire country, we've lost something, which is the ability to move through the world in the way that we normally do. And I think that when you enter change and enter that kind of that giant disruption into your life, it can really affect the way that you function on a lot of different levels. It's similarly to what I was saying about trauma, I think, and I'm sure you can elaborate more on that. But that it could affect focus. It can affect, like you were saying, focus and sleep, and I think emotional regularity, and like being able to regulate your emotions in the same way that you did before is a huge one. And I think that like one of the big things that I've been trying to talk to my patients about is not looking at your life through the lens of the way it looked before COVID or before a traumatic event, but looking at it through a lens of the fact that you're going through a pandemic, that we're going through, I don't even know what to call it, or racial inequality. I mean, that's always existed, but it's in kind of in people's faces. Revolution. And so if we continue to look at the way that we move through the world, in the same way, that, like comparing it to how we used to function pre-COVID and pre-revolution, that's not really fair to do, right? You have to change your expectation and be gentle with yourself that you're living through a pandemic. You may have lost a job. You may have lost people close to you. It's not really fair to similarly, like, don't fall into the comparison trap again of like, well, I don't know, I've never had a hard time focusing before. This isn't ever something that I've dealt with. Or like, I get so angry so quickly at my partner, or, whatever the difference may be. I think it's important to acknowledge that you are living through a pandemic. Like, be gentle with yourself.
I love that you are bringing that up. And what that brings to my mind is the whole reality of the fact that we are also doing all these things, living through things with those lenses. Something fun just happened at your house.
Derek is like moving the computer a quarter of an inch, and I'm like, can you just sit still?
Okay, what I was going to say is perfect for
Sorry
this.
about that, Doreen.
I love it. I love it. This is a conversation, and this is how they work. I love that what you talk about in terms of looking at it through the lens, because what that made me think about is how we are also constantly, because of how life is in 2020, we are constantly tempted to look at our experiences through the lens of social media, or look through the lens of other people's social media. And when you and I were talking before, that had me come up with this idea. So I've got this little prop here to show. But I had thought about the fact that each one of us and each person sharing space with us here has not just probably one loss or one traumatic experience that they've lived through, but possibly many. And it seemed to me like we could represent that by, like, everybody's got all these different strings in their life. Maybe they've got a work string and a family string and a where they live string and our emotional capability or our resilience string, and like grief is like a little knot in each one of those. And when you put many different knots together, it creates a much more complex knot. And so when we look at someone else and judge them based maybe on how their social media looks or how they're presenting themselves, it's easy to judge, or we can feel judged, when in reality we have this, each one of us has this super complex knot that we're kind of trying to untie, and we may not be untying it in the way that others imagine, and it may have, ours may have many more strings or many less. um, but I don't know, I've been living with this idea and thinking a lot because you brought up the really good point that we do tend to compare. And so I'm curious what your thoughts on that are, and what you've been noticing, like with performative culture and comparison culture and stuff, with all these multiple lenses that we're trying to navigate and manage.
Yeah, I think, and you can probably speak to this uh, because it is your field of expertise. But I'm curious. I would be curious to know your thoughts about the way that social media changes the way that we're expected to behave and move through the world, and especially in regards to something like trauma and grief, because there's almost this like expectation of vulnerability that comes up through social media. I call it like performative vulnerability, this idea that you have to be really vulnerable online, or like people won't think you're really grieving, or people won't think you care if you people will think you don't care if you don't like post something or make a really big public showing. And so there's a lot more pressure, I think, to move through the world with social media today. And I would imagine that you are seeing that a lot with your
I,
clients, and knowing that social media is such a big part of the work that you do.
yeah, so I should have brought that up, I guess, too, at the beginning. I also am a researcher and author, speaker about technology and how it shapes us. And I am thinking a lot about this, and thinking a lot about the fact that pre-pandemic, well, I hadn't really stopped to think, but pre-pandemic and pre-racial revolution, um,
Mm-hmm.
we were already spending 10 and a half hours a day on our devices, the research tells us. And that, I know, and the way that researchers get to that is that most Americans now, I think it's 85%, of Americans use more than one technology at a time. So let's say they're on their laptop and they're texting, or they're tweeting and watching a movie. And if you do that, if you're using two devices for 1 hour, the way the research codes it is that that's 2 hours of tech use. So if you think about the fact that we were pre-pandemic, pre-racial revolution, spending 10 and a half hours a day, I think it's fair to say that we are now spending much more than that. And that means a majority of our time is spent in these spaces, either collecting data and information, or connecting with others in a somewhat curated way, where what they present is curated and chosen. And we knew that in those 10 and a half hours a day, we've just had two pretty large scale research studies, first ever of their kind, that have shown not just that there's a correlation between high levels of social media use, including gaming, because gaming is considered a social media. So high levels of social media use are correlated, we've known this for a long time, correlated with depression, anxiety, and this kind of ambient sense of a fear of missing out that makes us hyper vigilant about the ways in which we are not enough. And so, right prior to the beginning of the year, this new research came out that showed not only a correlational impact, but also a causational impact, saying that high levels of social media use, including gaming, can cause, actually not can, does cause
Wow.
depression, anxiety, and that sense of kind of like, how am I not getting it? And I think that's a particularly sticky, that last one is a particularly sticky dynamic right now, because there's so much, I think there are so many big feelings about everything that's going on. And for some people, there's a rapidity of wanting to post about it, maybe without thinking. And then a lot
Mm-hmm.
of important correction happening in those spaces, people correcting them.
Yeah.
But then also, I think there is the tendency to kind of performatively kind of post in a way that can be really harmful to people.
Yeah. Well, and I appreciated what you said, like bringing that idea of I'm not good enough coming up a lot, and I think that um, similarly, like we're constantly comparing and on social media, and if that, especially during COVID, when at the beginning of it, at least, when we were quarantined to our houses, we weren't allowed to go out into the world at all.
Mm-hmm.
The only way that you're really connecting with people is through social media or is online in some way. And so, yeah, I would imagine that those feelings, it would be interesting to see that research now, like post quarantine, and see how it's changed, or if it has, and if like screen time has increased dramatically, and if so, like how does that also correlate with people's mood?
Right.
Yeah, that's more just questions that I have about that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a place where I find a lot of folks talking about that sense of feeling both, which you could speak to far better than I, but that sense of feeling somewhat addicted to it. Like when I'm connected to my screens, a lot of the time I feel depressed. I feel like I don't measure up or I'm not doing things right, but I can't stop.
Yeah, yeah. I think that well, it's interesting, and I'm sure that the research that you've done has shown this as well. But like social media and technology, it targets the reward pathway in a similar way that drugs and alcohol or other substances, yeah, do. And so when you get that little red notification, or the little ping on your phone that comes up, it's still releasing dopamine, and it's still releasing that it's still going to that reward pathway. And so as you continue to use that and continue to reinforce this reward pathway over and over and over again, that when you then take that stimulus away, it's going to feel like withdrawal, right? That you
Absolutely.
I've definitely had it where I'm like, I swear I felt my phone buzz, or like checking, like, is anybody messaging me? Or like when I've deleted apps off of my phone before, I'd not even thinking, just go to like be on Instagram, and then be like, wait, I deleted this. Like, how did I get here? What is happening? And so, yeah, you can experience. I don't know. Have you found that at all? That people that you've worked with are like, I'm going through withdrawals from my phone.
Oh, it's a very real thing. It's a totally real thing. And what it leads me to think of in light of this conversation, I'm sort of loving the idea that you bring up, which is the tricky thing with technology is that it does exactly what you're saying. It goes to the reward centers of the brain. Dopamine is released. It also encourages the release of adrenaline from the endocrine system. So you've got this kind of surge of all this, what feels like positive energy, but actually it looks physiologically like dysregulation. So it creates kind of a sense of dysregulation. And in addition, technology can actually not just accidentally stimulate those reward centers, but it can actually be created in such a way, and oftentimes is. And I don't mean that developers are making these things maliciously. It's just a cool thing they can do now. They can develop it. Sometimes it's maliciously, but they can develop it actually, their technology and the platforms in such a way that the rational or reasoning centers of the brain required to be able to help us come to a state of emotional regulation are actually shortchanged or missed or pruned off.
Which is exactly what happens in addiction, right? That like
Right.
you're that like you're functioning more of like the limbic system, and the like instinctual, like I guess they call it like the reptilian brain,
Yeah. Yeah.
that comes out. And it's probably like exactly what's happening then with technology. Yeah, that
It's
you're no longer.
exactly that. You're
Yeah, yeah,
overstimulating the left lower part of the brain. And one of the reasons that I think this is really important for our conversation is that when we are faced with loss or faced with trauma or faced with grief, right now, oftentimes because we haven't practiced the ability to regulate ourselves and practiced the ability to come back into ourselves, we go right to this or substances or other things that can actually create increased harm and increased dysregulation rather than
Yeah.
knowing how to lean into our feelings.
Yeah, I think that that's like one of the main functions of, substance or technology, if we're going on that too, is like a way to numb out, is a way to
Mhm.
not really be in your emotional, the current emotional state that you're in, like trying to avoid that in some way. And that can, with social media, trying to fabricate um, other emotions, like, oh, I'm just having such a great day. And I saw my friends and family and I feel invigorated. And then you're getting all these likes, and it's like this false sense of comfort, where actually what you're feeling is a lot of emotional distress, but not wanting to look at that because it feels uncomfortable.
That's right. And what I have just a ton of compassion for is when people do that in the hopes of getting support and then they don't even get the support there. So
Yeah.
and so I think that's one of the things I would love to hear from you. Like, I would love to give people the benefit of anything that you and I have learned over the course of however many, months and years of working with people about how we can all, not they, how we can all come to know our own feelings, come to name them, come to actually not be afraid of them, not want to avoid them with things that numb us out, but instead kind of lean into them. I want so I'm curious if you have thoughts, and then I'll chime in with some ideas too.
Yeah. One of the things that I love to use as a clinician is having patients listen to their somatic response. So, what their body is telling them. So, a lot of work on, like, I'm feeling really angry right now. Okay, where do you feel that anger? What does anger feel like when it comes up for you? Do you feel it in your chest? Do you feel it in your heart? What is happening? Do you get really sweaty? What happens when you feel happy? Also, paying attention to somatic cues that happen in your body when it's not distressing, when an emotion that feels good. Um, like, do you feel a lightness in your chest? Do you feel like, I don't know, I feel like sometimes when I'm happy, I get like tingly around like the smile area. That's not a clinical term at all. But like,
I,
yeah, just having people, I think a basic start for understanding and sitting with your emotions is to first look at how they're showing up in your body. And that can be really hard for people that have experienced trauma. And because of that trauma, whether, sometimes if it's physical, emotional, or sexual, they've trained themselves really well to detach from their body, right? And to not be in touch with how their body's feeling at all. And so I think for me, a basic place to start is just like, where do you feel emotions in your body, and start to, whether that's like journaling them or processing it with somebody, but just having an awareness of what that feels like. And that can also point to why it feels uncomfortable, right? Like, we're like, I don't know why I don't want to be in anger right now, or I don't know why I don't want to be depressed, but like, it makes sense that you don't want to feel anger or depression right now. Like, those don't feel good in your body. So yeah, what do you think?
what I love about that, I oftentimes think about those things as the message indicators in our body, but we are
Mm-hmm.
so tuned into the message indicators outside of us that it's hard for us to be
Yeah.
tuned in. And then I do think you're right also that when people have experienced trauma, there's just that sense of kind of compartmentalization or depersonalization of the body. And one of the things that makes me so sad, I very frequently will hear clients, or after I've spoken, folks will come up and say, I know you talked about, or because I usually do a lot with breathing and meditation, and
Yeah.
they will come up and say, if they've had trauma, they can't breathe. Like, it's this thing that we culturally tell people, if you're stressed or if you're feeling big feelings, breathe. And it's kind of like, that is a source of huge actual panic for me. They will say, if I try to take a deep breath in, because I feel then I'm off guard. If I relax, then I'm at risk. And so I think something that you said made me think about that, about how it's so important for each person to have their own way of tapping in. One thing that I have found really effective for those folks who do have, have encoded trauma in their body, and is to do something like what I call a brain dump or a feeling dump, where you just take a piece of paper and you set a timer for 5 minutes, and you don't try to write in a narrative form. You don't think about you're going to read it later or try to make sense of it, but you just write whatever feelings or thoughts or experiences come to mind on this piece of paper. And at the end of that time, you kind of sit with it. I will sometimes encourage people to literally take it, and kind of hold it at their heart, like, okay, these are the things that are inside of me, and I now have pivoted to them and go and put them in a fireproof bowl and burn them, or tear them up and put them in the garbage. And then to redirect them into something pleasurable. And that can be really, really meaningful.
Yeah, I love that. I love that idea of like being able to put what's inside of you or outside of yourself in some way. I think that's to also create some separation between you and that thing, because sometimes like when those things live inside of us and they're just sitting with us and like festering, and it feels really lonely and scary and uncomfortable. And so to be able to like have it out on paper and outside of yourself in some way can be transformative, I think. Yeah, I love that.
I did this thing at the beginning of COVID that I need to return to it. I've gotten away from it, but I put 2 bowls. Well, actually, I started with 1 bowl and little strips of paper on the counter. And every time I would or my consciousness was turned towards something I was losing or missing out on, a trip would get canceled or an event would get canceled, I would write it on a piece of paper as a loss and put it in that bowl. And then at the end of every week, I would kind of honor it, and then I would burn it. As a way of kind of taking in, like, okay, I feel sadness about this. I'm actually going to take the energy to grieve it, to name this as grief and loss. And then somebody suggested, and I thought it was brilliant, so I added a second bowl, and that bowl was for gratitudes, And so one other great thing when we are grieving, it can help us to know that we aren't going to be lost or swallowed by our grief if we're also paying attention to that which we're grateful for. And we don't, that's not, I don't mean that as a way of denial, or just buck up, you've got good things to be happy about, so you shouldn't feel sad. But instead, as a way of saying, no, the painful, and recognizing it and owning it, naming it, letting it exist, letting it feel its way through me, and then also knowing that I have these other things I can turn to.
Yeah, I mean, gratitude is such a powerful practice. If you can get in the habit of practicing gratitude, there's so many physiological, psychological, social benefits to practicing gratitude. And I say practice because I think it does take, it's a process. You have to be intentional about it. Yeah, I think, well, it's that dialectic, right, of the both and, like you were saying, not wanting to minimize it, but recognizing, like, you can acknowledge that you have things you're really having a lot of pain around and things that are really difficult in your life, and still be able to experience gratitude. Like, those two things can exist in the same space. And just because you are grateful, for a friend doesn't mean that you are now forgetting about the fact you've lost out on a lot of other things. I don't know. Like, I think that you don't have, just because you're practicing gratitude doesn't mean that you're not acknowledging and recognizing that you're experiencing grief as well. But certainly not in just like buck up and like there's stuff to be grateful for. Like,
I think so many times. Yeah. And I think so many times that buck up gets ruined for us in childhood. Like, parents oftentimes will be kind of like, I don't have space for your big feelings. They don't say it that way. but they'll, just so get over it. And so I think a lot of times what you just bring up for me is that this is such a new idea for so many of us to be able to say they're both and, that I'm both. I can be really sad or I can be really angry and I can still function or I can see beauty or whatever. I mean, I really love that you are bringing that to our attention.
Yeah, like just like I think that oftentimes people that are experiencing great loss and grief will feel guilty about also experiencing joy, right? That it's like, well, my mom died and like I feel guilty for enjoying spending time with my friends, or I feel really bad that I'm like having a great meal right now and I'm liking it. Like
Mhm.
I feel like because I should be sad, or like putting that should into the uh, into your vernacular. Just like you are allowed to be sad and grieve and experience that loss, and you still have the right to experience happiness and joy.
I
Like
think
that
that
doesn't
is
take the loss that you experience. Yeah.
I think that's a really specifically tricky thing, and I'm thinking about that like right now in relation to everything that's going on in our world that is so important that we keep our eyes open about, and also being able to recognize, this would have been Pride Month at a time that
Yeah.
we would think of as coming together and celebrating. And so is it okay to how do we kind of toggle back and forth and um, remain flexible in our feelings, eyes wide open to the real reality of pain and loss, and yet also in whatever small ways we can open and receptive to the places that we can find comfort or even pleasure. Just really
Yeah. That
hard.
it's really hard, especially when you don't want to be, like bringing in social media again too. Like that, like there's that adds, I think,
Yeah,
a whole other component of complication to the game. Yeah.
absolutely. You brought up something too in passing in one of the comments you just made about support, and I was curious if if you had thoughts about, because I know that's another thing. Like in times of grief and having our trauma be peaked, it can be really helpful to have support. And right now, that looks so different with still sheltering in place orders in place. I'm just curious what your if you have guidelines or thoughts or ideas.
Yeah. I mean, as far as supports, I'm doing a lot of like work around finding resources for my patients, like online AA meetings,
Mm,
or recovery meetings, or recovery Dharma meetings. Those are all sober support groups. I don't know about as many online grief support groups, but I would imagine that those are definitely
yeah,
there and that exist. And I think like finding people in your life that are safe, that feel like you could go to and reach out to, and recognizing, I think one of the biggest barriers for people reaching out is that they feel like a burden. I hear that so often of like, oh, I don't want to call this person, or I don't want to be a burden. I feel like I should have like a that word is like not allowed in written sessions, because I hear it so
yes,
often that people just like don't want to be a burden, they don't want to reach out, but recognizing that actually providing acts of service and providing support to people is mutually beneficial. It feels really nice to feel wanted and to feel like someone trusts you enough to go to you, that someone is coming to you for support. That feels really good. And so I think for people to keep in mind that support is like there's a mutual beneficiary.
yeah,
That's
yeah.
not a word.
It's been mutually
It's
beneficial.
mutually beneficial, yeah. And that can help kind of break down that barrier of like, oh, I don't want to reach out. I don't know. Do you feel like that's a common thing that you hear as well?
Yeah.
It's like
all the time. And one thing I've really been leaning into in this season in terms of ideas and for myself as well is that, I think it's very real right now that people do have a lot of well, I find people are kind of falling, at least the people I'm in touch with, into two camps. Either they're overwhelmed and they are video chatted out and, every kind of not in-person communication overwhelm. Or they're feeling very, very bored and very alone and also really touch starved if they have been sheltering, without others, the need for kinesthetic touch is so real. And so I have been thinking a lot about those two groups and thinking that one thing that people can do within their circle of support is to kind of define people in their lives where they can make an agreement ahead of time that, if I feel really lonely or if I feel like I'm kind of losing it on a day, can I just text you and have you hold that with me? Or can I call you and we're going to literally set our timers for 5 minutes? I'm not, so I can feel like I can call you because I'm not going to interrupt your day. And if you can't answer, you can't answer. But can you be that person for me and can I be that person for you? And maybe having a couple of people that you have a preset arrangement with so that you really don't have an excuse to lean into that feeling of I'm going to be a burden because we've already agreed to it. And it has had really some pretty profound results for people. Another thing that I've been really encouraging. Pardon? No, what?
I was
Please.
just gonna say it's a support accountability buddy.
That's awesome. I love that. That's so great. I've also been encouraging people to take breaks if they feel like, and some people really feel like they can't take a break from the media because they're in an at-risk group or, really important, they're doing important social justice work, but to create those same kind of buddies where, maybe I need to take a day off of the press. And so I can rely on my friend, whoever, who's going to be in touch with the press that day, or keeping tabs. And if there's some really important thing I need to do, they'll let me know, or at the end of the day they can update me. But that's another way that I've been encouraging people to take support, because when we are dealing with grief and trauma, and again, we want that feeling, a rush of goodness, we will look to this for it, and oftentimes this very thing actually causes us more decline. So trying to find any way of reaching out to social supports. And then I do want to talk about getting your body some attention in this time. If people are feeling a lot of big feelings and grieving and feeling trauma and don't have others in their sheltering kind of bubble that they can rely on for some general forms of touch, long hot baths or showers, maybe participating in an online ecstatic dance class, or sometimes in some communities they're called dance church, and it's just a Zoom room with everybody's just doing their own thing. You're not learning moves, you're just moving your body. You could lay on the floor and stretch the whole time. Foam rollers, doing a little bit of a self massage with foam rollers, or even a tennis ball. Wrapping yourself up in a blanket and like really literally pulling the ends tight to kind of approximate the feeling of being held, or wrapping yourself up in a hammock.
What's good for that too, I think, is weighted blankets. If people have the means to get a weighted blanket, like wrapping yourself up in that is like recognizing that it's not going to substitute touch necessarily, but it can feel it's a coping skill that you can use.
Absolutely.
For it. Yeah. Sarah's letting me know that it's question time.
Great.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah. So I'm hoping somebody asks one. We're gonna just give them a minute. You guys can keep chatting.
Okay.
One thing I found for people, because weighted blankets can be somewhat expensive, someone after a recent talk they took a pillowcase even maybe, and just cut it and filled it with rice and dry beans, and then sewed it up. But it was larger than just the eye compresses that you see, and so it was heavy, but it was about this big, and they could just put it on their chest when they laid down, and it felt kind of like a little bit of compression, and even that is a good solution.
Ones that you can warm up.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
So
and that's
put it in
so
the
nice
microwave,
too.
and it's heavy and just right here. I think she even put some lavender in it. And it's just another workaround.
I love that one. Yeah, if I were crafty enough, I might think about doing that myself. But we have a question.
Mm.
This one is from Alyssa. What are some ways you are searching and finding good news for inspiration?
Mm. That makes me think about the Mr. Rogers quote that I know is, probably too often shared, but that says, always look for the helpers. And one of the things
Mm-hmm.
that I've been trying to do is notice, who are the people who are out there, um, who are both oftentimes, well supported, so they can afford to do the hard work of revolution, but looking toward the helpers. I am finding huge comfort in the library service right now. If you have a library card, most libraries in the US offer access to a service called Canopy, which is free. And they offer an incredible set of films and movies for adults. But the thing that I've been loving for inspiration and comfort is they have a whole kids side, and you can find any children's book and have it read to you. And
Oh
it
my
is
God,
just amazing. So that's something that's free and that I've been really finding. How about you,
yeah.
Emma?
I think that I've been like honestly something that I've been trying to do is like reframe things as good. Like I'm all about like strength based perspective, and so you see that the world is in turmoil right now, or it feels like that, and so instead of thinking like, man, the world is falling apart, the world is going to shit, thinking about actually like a lot of people are coming together for a cause, and that's huge.
Mm-hmm.
So I've just been doing, yeah, a lot of like reframing of already existing news and trying to recognize, like, I know when COVID started and like we couldn't do anything, I was like, wow, that's really shitty. I hate this. But then being able to reframe it to, it's like that, yes, it's shitty. And it's really awesome that, organizations and bars and restaurants are willing to put their business on hold and to like work towards what they see as a greater good. Um, and
Yeah,
so that's,
I did a lot of
yeah.
reframing during the early days of COVID with myself saying, I am part of the solution. Like by my
Yeah.
staying home, I am part of what's going to change. Like, yeah, I think
Yeah.
reframing is a great, yeah.
I think, yeah, I do a lot of reframing, and then I follow a lot of like animal accounts, like so that I'm like, I've got like the like my Instagram is like activists, drag queens, and animals, and that's like what my feed will look like
Good.
lately. Yeah, like finding, like, even if people are speaking out about things that are really, I'm hearing a lot of my Black and brown friends speaking about this being a painful time, and absolutely. And so instead of saying like, man, this is so shitty, like acknowledging that they're taking the time to be able to say that, and that they're using their emotional and educational labor to like put that out into the world is a really beautiful thing. And so, yeah, a lot of reframing.
We have another
That
question.
led me
What
to,
is? Oh, we have another question.
oh, okay, great. Go
Oh,
for
but
it.
you can go. Finish your thought.
Okay. Well, one thought that just came to me is I love that question that Alyssa asked, and I'm thinking a lot about there's this old Shaker hymn that is the main line is bright in the corner where you are. And so I'm trying to think a lot about it in terms of if I feel like I need inspiration, then maybe it's up to me to go out and be the inspiration in that hour. Like I'm just going to brighten the corner where I am, sidewalk chalk all over the sidewalk or write a couple of notes of encouragement or whatever. So that's another way I'm trying to deal with that.
Be the change you wish to see in the world.
Yeah.
This is from Ashley Marie. The pandemic has caused me to have problems trusting my friends because of the health risks, but the lack of in-person and physical interaction with them is equally difficult. What are some coping mechanisms to better feel some sense of joy rather than fear when around small groups of friends again?
Yeah. I would love to to take that, if that's okay, Emma, for at least, and then love your thoughts. But I've been doing a lot of work with a group of physicians and scientists about this very issue because the psychological reality of the cost related to the physical potential risk is real. And so there is a lot of indication that if you are following the guidelines set out within your state and you are doing the hard work of washing your hands and everybody is masked, that there is some reason to go ahead and take small risks to get your emotional needs met in those kinds of settings. So I want to say that first. And second of all, I would encourage you to find, if you can't talk with those friends specifically about how this has been hard with some people taking greater risks and maybe you not, find someone that you can process that with verbally, or if not verbally, write or find an online resource, which I've given Sarah some resources for places like that specifically related to COVID, because it is very real, and people who have been very careful are feeling a lot of the psychological distress of the costliness of that. And so it is important that you grieve that you have lost real social connection before you just try to reconnect, because otherwise that grief will be kind of, poking at you all the time when you're trying to connect. So I would encourage you to find really important places you can be honest with your frustrations and sadness.
Yeah. And like recognizing that like that those are legitimate fears. I think that like feeling like you're the only, like there's this sense, I think sometimes it's like I'm the only one that really cares, like no one even cares anymore. And so like recognizing that you're holding a lot by feeling like you have to be the only friend that is quote unquote safe, I guess. Like that
Yeah, so I sort of
feeling
want to,
feeling that pressure is a lot.
it's so much. And Sarah, can you remind us of the name of this
I think
person?
it's Ashley.
Ashley?
I think her name is Ashley.
Okay, so it's like I kind of want to say, Ashley, thank you for taking this so seriously and for being care filled for others and making sure that you don't unknowingly pass this along, and take that in and know that we all here together affirm and validate your choices and understand the losses that you've had. I don't know, I really want to do that.
Yeah. Awesome. We don't have any more questions right now. It looks like we're getting towards the end. I know that you had a meditation that you wanted to finish us off on. I think that if you're willing, now it would be a good time.
Yeah. If folks would like to,
I want to say gratitude to you for doing this, and gratitude for Sarah for kind of organizing this and putting this together, and everyone else that was involved in the making of this. I really appreciate it, and thank you for giving us a voice. And yeah, thank you.
thank you.
Gratitude.
Yeah, thank you, Emma, and everyone at the Dru Project. And I have immense feelings. I'm holding immense feelings of compassion for you in particular as you face into tomorrow and the weekend ahead. Doing the work of keeping memories alive of those we have lost is costly, and so thank you. So we thought we would just close with a little bit of a grounding meditation that you can use right now for the next 5 minutes as we do it together, and take it with you past this time together. So if you feel comfortable, you might want to close your eyes or at least lower your gaze. I'm going to do that. And just take some deep breaths in through your nose and out through your mouth. This kind of breathing is particularly helpful for calming. I think about it as smelling the roses, so inhaling through the nose, blowing out the candles, exhaling out through the mouth. And as you do that, I'd like for you to imagine right at the space where your heart lives, there being this flame. And that flame is the unique light that is you. It's everything that is special and unique about you, even if others haven't seen it as special and unique. Maybe you want to put your hands there on your heart to feel it. And on the next inhale, I want you to imagine that flame growing just a little bit brighter. And on the exhale, it growing a little bit wider. And on each inhale, it grows a little bit brighter. And each exhale, a little bit wider. Until this unique light and energy and love that is you, the spark that is you, is filling up all of you with such a brightness that it's bumping up against the edges of the inside of your body. It's filling you so much that on this next inhale, that light, that love, that brightness becomes so bright and then so wide that it bursts out of you. And it literally kind of commingles with that of everyone else who's with us on this video experience. That I am sending a little bit of my light, my care, my love to you. And when I inhale, I'm inhaling a little bit of yours into me. Continuing to make that flame brighter and wider. And then on this next inhale, try to kind of gather it back up. Bring it back into you. Express gratitude to those that you've shared this time and space with. And then really center yourself in gratitude for this flame that is you, that stays alive, that keeps going, even amidst great grief. Commit to tending to that flame. And then bring your attention back out into the room, into the space that we share together. I want to just affirm and validate the griefs and losses you felt. And Emma, I'll let you kind of sign us off.
Yeah, I mean, it's a hard one to finish, to follow. Yeah, just that recognizing that tomorrow will be a really, really painful and difficult day for a lot of people, and just to be gentle with yourself, and that you're deserving of that gentleness, despite what the thoughts inside your head might say. You are absolutely worthy of taking time for yourself and allowing yourself time to grieve and just being gentle with yourself. So thank you.
I love that.
Do anything else?
No, that's it.
Okay. Cool. Thank you.
You can
Bye.
check. So wait, actually, Sarah, where can folks find the resource list?
I put it in the comments section.
Perfect. It's there. And you're also welcome to check out my website. I have a resource list as well, DoreenDM.com. So thank you all. You are beloved and wonderful.
Bye.